The air at the shooting range was always thick and heavy, a strange cocktail of smells that you couldn't find anywhere else. It was part acrid gunpowder, part the hot metal of the barrels, and part something else, something more primal. It was the smell of adrenaline and focus, a scent that hung in the air like a visible haze on a hot Saturday afternoon. This particular Saturday was no different. The regulars were out in full force. A loose gathering of men who found a certain kind of peace in the controlled violence of the range. They stood in their assigned lanes, a row of modern-day warriors clad in tactical pants and polo shirts, their expensive firearms gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights. Down at the far end of the line, a group of 3 friends were making the most of their afternoon. They were younger, probably in their late 20s or early 30s, and they had the kind of easy, loud confidence that comes from youth and a bit of money in their pockets. Their rifles were not just tools. They were status symbols. One had a sleek black AR-15 with more attachments than a Swiss Army knife. Its scope so large it looked like it belonged on an observatory telescope. Another was showing off a new, custom-built handgun, its frame a shimmering, almost unnatural shade of Cerakote blue. They laughed a lot, their voices echoing off the concrete walls and the thick plexiglass dividers that separated each shooting lane. Their laughter was the main sound in the building, a boisterous soundtrack to the rhythmic pop-pop-pop of gunfire. They were taking turns showing off their skills. One of them would send a cascade of bullets downrange, tearing the center out of a paper target. And then he would turn back to his friends with a triumphant grin, looking for approval. "Did you see that group?" One of them would yell over the ringing in his ears. Tight as a tick. The others would cheer and slap him on the back, their camaraderie as much a part of the ritual as the shooting itself. For them, this was a sanctuary. It was a place where they could be loud, be powerful, and feel in control. It was their world, with its own rules and its own kind of people. And then, someone new walked into their world. The heavy glass door to the lobby swung open with a pneumatic hiss, and a figure stepped inside, pausing for a moment to let her eyes adjust to the dimmer light. The contrast was so immediate, so jarring. It was as if a character from a different movie had accidentally wandered onto the set. It was an old woman. She was tiny, really. Her frame so slight that the bulky cardigan she wore seemed to swallow her whole. Her hair was a soft white cloud pinned up in a neat bun on the back of her head, and a few stray wisps had escaped to frame a face that was a delicate road map of wrinkles. She looked like someone who should be tending to a garden or baking cookies, not stepping into a place that smelled like fire and fury. The group of friends at the end of the range was the first to notice her. Their conversation died mid-sentence. The one with the blue handgun nudged his friend, a smirk already playing on his lips. "Hey," he said, keeping his voice low, but not low enough. "I think your grandma's here to pick you up." The third man chuckled, a short, sharp sound of amusement. They watched as she walked slowly toward the counter, her steps careful and measured. She wore sensible shoes and a simple dress that peeked out from under her cardigan. In her hands, she clutched a worn leather case. It was scuffed and dark with age. It's a kind of case a musician might use to carry a violin or a flute. The man behind the counter, a burly guy with a thick beard and a "Don't Tread on Me" t-shirt, looked up from his paperwork. His expression was one of mild surprise, but he was a professional. He'd seen all sorts of people come through these doors. "Can I help you, ma'am?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. The old woman smiled, a gentle, genuine smile that crinkled the corners of her eyes. "Yes, thank you," she said. Her voice was soft, a little thin, but clear. "I'd like to rent a lane for an hour, please. And I'll need a target." The man nodded, not missing a beat. "You got your own firearm, or will you be renting one of ours?" "Oh, I have my own," she said, patting the leather case lovingly. "She's an old friend." Behind them, the snickering from the trio at the end of the range grew a little louder. They were trying to be discreet, leaning in toward each other and whispering, but their amusement was obvious. They found the whole situation hilarious. This little old lady, with her grandmotherly demeanor and her mysterious instrument case, was a punchline they hadn't been expecting. The man at the counter processed her payment. handing her a laminated card with her lane number and a set of bright orange ear protectors. "Lane 4, he said. "Safety rules are on the wall. Gotta wear eye and ear protection at all times inside the range." The woman nodded, taking the items with a quiet thank you. She seemed completely oblivious to the attention she was getting. Or if she wasn't, she was doing an excellent job of ignoring it. She moved with a slow, unhurried grace, as if she had all the time in the world. She carefully put on the large, oversized earmuffs, which made her look even smaller and more fragile. Then, she picked up her leather case and began the long walk down the concrete aisle, toward the empty lanes. As she passed the group of friends, their whispers stopped. They watched her, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and undisguised mockery. The one with the fancy ARL5 couldn't resist. "Need a hand with that, ma'am?" he called out, his voice laced with a thick, syrupy sweetness that was anything but sincere. "It looks awfully heavy." His friends snickered, nudging each other with their elbows. They were waiting for her to be flustered, to be intimidated. They expected her to blush, to maybe hurry her steps to get away from them. But the old woman didn't do any of that. She stopped walking. She turned her head slowly, her gaze settling on the young man who had spoken. Her eyes, behind the thick lenses of her glasses, were a pale, watery blue. But there was something sharp and intelligent in them. For a moment, she just looked at him, her expression unreadable. Then, a small smile touched her lips again. It wasn't the warm smile she had given the man at the counter. This one was different. It was polite, but it held a certain distance, a quiet firmness. "That's very kind of you to offer," she said, her voice muffled slightly by the earmuffs, but still perfectly audible. "But I believe I can manage." With that, she turned her head back and continued her walk, her pace never faltering. The young man was left standing there, his mouth slightly open. He had been deflected, dismissed with a courtesy that felt more like a reprimand than any angry words could have been. His friends looked at each other, a little thrown off by her calm response. They had been looking for an easy target for their jokes. But she hadn't played her part. She finally reached lane 4. An empty space sandwiched between two men who were so focused on their own shooting that they hadn't even noticed her arrival. She placed her leather case on the small metal shelf just below the counter, the sound of it landing with a soft, solid thud. Then she began to prepare. Her movements were methodical, almost ritualistic. She took off her cardigan, folding it neatly and placing it on a chair in the corner of the lane. Underneath, she wore a simple, short-sleeved blouse, revealing surprisingly toned arms for a woman of her age. She then turned her attention back to the leather case. The trio at the end of the range watched, their initial amusement now replaced by a grudging curiosity. They were still expecting a joke, some kind of anticlimax. They were convinced she was going to pull out some tiny antique pistol, something that belonged in a museum. They leaned against the divider, their arms crossed, waiting for the show to begin. The woman unlatched the two worn brass buckles on the case. The sound of them popping open was surprisingly loud in the relative quiet between volleys of gunfire. She lifted the lid, and for a moment her body blocked the view of what was inside. She reached in with both hands, her grip firm and sure. And then she lifted it out. It wasn't a pistol. It was a rifle. A collective, almost inaudible gasp seemed to travel down the line of shooters. The young men at the end of the range straightened up, their smirks finally vanishing. It was a bolt-action rifle with a long, dark barrel and a stock made of a rich, dark wood that was worn smooth in places from years of use. It wasn't flashy or modern. It had no attachments, no fancy scope. It was just wood and steel, but it had an undeniable presence. A quiet dignity that was completely at odds with the black plastic firearms of the men nearby. It looked old, but not in a fragile way. It looked like a tool that had been made to last, a tool that had been used and cared for by someone who knew what they were doing. The woman held the rifle with an ease that belied its apparent weight. She didn't struggle or strain. She simply cradled it in her arms as if it were the most natural thing in the world. She ran a soft cloth over the barrel, her movements slow and deliberate, her eyes scanning every inch of the metal with an intensity that was almost reverent. The boisterous energy of the range seemed to fade away, the loud laughter and boasting replaced by a hushed, focused silence. Everyone was watching now. The men in the adjacent lanes had paused their shooting, turning to see what was happening. The man behind the counter had leaned forward, his forearms resting on the counter, his eyes fixed on the old woman in lane 4. The trio of friends stood in stunned silence. This was not what they had expected. Not at all. The frail old lady they had mocked just moments before had vanished, replaced by someone they didn't recognize at all. She was no longer a punchline. She was a mystery. And as she began to assemble the rifle with a practiced, economical grace, a strange new feeling began to settle over the young men who had been so quick to judge. It was a feeling they hadn't expected to feel that day. It was the feeling of being in the presence of someone who just might know a whole lot more than they did. The air in the range, once thick with their arrogance, now felt charged with a different kind of energy entirely. Asterisk. The silence that fell over the shooting range was a strange and fragile thing. It was not a complete silence, of course. The air still hummed with the low thrum of the ventilation system and the distant, muffled sounds of the world outside. But the dominant noise, the loud, boisterous energy that had filled the room just moments before, had vanished. The young men at the end of the line were no longer laughing. They stood perfectly still, their eyes locked on the small figure in lane 4. Their expressions a mixture of disbelief and a dawning, uneasy curiosity. The old woman paid them no mind. Her entire world had shrunk to the 6-foot by 6-foot space of her shooting lane and the long, dark rifle in her hands. She moved with a quiet, unhurried purpose that was mesmerizing to watch. After wiping down the barrel, she reached back into her leather case and pulled out a small, unlabeled metal tin. She opened it, revealing a neat row of brass cartridges, each one gleaming under the fluorescent lights. They looked different from the modern, sleek ammunition the young men were using. These had a certain old-fashioned look to them, as if they had been made in a different era. She picked one up, holding it between her thumb and forefinger, examining it for a moment with the same focused intensity she had given the rifle. Then she opened the bolt on the rifle, the movement smooth and well-oiled, a solid clack that echoed in the quiet room. She carefully placed the single cartridge into the chamber, her fingers moving with a steady precision that spoke of long practice. She didn't just load the gun. She seemed to be communicating with it. Silent conversation between a person and their tool. The man who had first called out to her, the one with the high-tech AR-15, felt a knot of confusion tighten in his stomach. He looked at his own rifle, with its polymer stock and its red dot sight, and then back at her simple wooden firearm. It felt like he was comparing a brand-new sports car to a vintage, hand-built locomotive. His was designed for speed and efficiency, a product of modern engineering. Hers felt like it had a soul, a history. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was completely out of his depth. And he didn't like it one bit. His friend, the one with the Cerakote blue handgun, was the first to break the tense silence. He tried to recapture some of their earlier bravado, forcing a laugh that sounded hollow and fake. "Well, look at that," he said, nudging the third man in their group. "She's loading it one bullet at a time. At this rate, we'll be old as her by the time she's done." The comment was meant to be a joke, a way to reclaim the ground they felt they had lost. But it fell flat. The old woman didn't even flinch. She simply closed the bolt on the rifle, the sound, another decisive, metallic click. She was not in a race. She was not there to put on a show for them. She was there for her own reasons, and their opinions were clearly the last thing on her mind. This quiet dismissal was more infuriating than any angry retort could have been. It was as if they were nothing more than background noise, an inconvenience she had to tolerate. The first man felt a flush of heat rise to his neck. His pride, which had been so comfortably inflated just a few minutes ago, was now badly bruised. He needed to do something, to say something, to get a reaction, to prove that he was still in control of the situation. "Grandma!" He called out again, his voice louder this time, more aggressive. The few other shooters in the range turned to look, their expressions a mixture of annoyance at the disruption and curiosity about the unfolding drama. "You need some help sighting that thing in? That scope looks like it came off a toy rifle." You probably couldn't hit the side of a barn from in here." This time his friends didn't laugh. They just stood there, shifting their weight uncomfortably. They could sense that the line had been crossed. The joke was no longer funny. The old woman finally stopped what she was doing. She had been about to attach a simple, worn leather sling to the rifle, but her hands paused mid-air. She turned around slowly to face them. She took off her large earmuffs and let them hang around her neck. The sudden removal of the barrier made her seem more present, more formidable. Her pale blue eyes met the young man's gaze, and for the first time, he felt a flicker of genuine fear. There was no anger in her eyes, no trace of the frailty he had initially seen. There was only a deep, unnerving calm. It was the look of a patient teacher dealing with a disruptive child. "You seem to know a lot about rifles," she said, her voice soft but carrying clearly in the silent room. "It's a good thing to be passionate about your hobbies." The young man was taken aback. He had expected her to be flustered, to get angry, to do something that would make him look superior. But this calm, almost pitying response was completely disarming. He opened his mouth to say something, but no words came out. She continued, her gaze unwavering. "This rifle doesn't have a scope. It uses iron sights. And as for hitting the side of a barn, well, we'll see." She gave him that same small, polite smile from before, the one that was more of a shield than a welcome. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I'd like to get started. I find it difficult to concentrate with so much chatter." With that, she turned her back on them and put her earmuffs back on, effectively ending the conversation. She was a fortress. They were just a bunch of noisy children throwing pebbles at her walls. The young man stood there, his face burning with a mixture of anger and humiliation. He had been put in his place, not with a harsh word, but with a quiet dignity that made him feel small and foolish. He looked at his friends, but they were pointedly looking elsewhere, suddenly fascinated by the targets on their own lanes. He was on his own. The old woman returned to her preparations. She attached the leather sling to the rifle, adjusting the length with a few expert tugs. Then, she picked up a paper target from the stack on the counter. It was a standard target, a series of concentric circles with a bullseye in the center. She walked it over to the clip mechanism that sent it downrange. With the press of a button, the target began its journey. Sliding silently away from her down the long, narrow alley, the young men watched, their eyes fixed on the small piece of paper as it receded into the distance. It went past the 25-yard mark, then the 50-yard mark. It kept going. The man at the counter leaned forward even more, his brow furrowed in concentration. The other shooters had all but forgotten about their own guns, their attention completely captivated by the scene in lane 4. The target finally stopped at the 100-yard line. The maximum distance for the indoor range. From where they were standing, the black circles of the target were barely visible. A small, dark smudge against the beige back wall. Shooting a rifle with iron sights at 100 yards was not easy. It required skill, practice, and a very good eye. The young man with the AR-15 felt another wave of unease. He wouldn't even attempt that shot without his expensive scope. He certainly wouldn't do it with just a single round in the chamber. The old woman walked back to her lane. She did not immediately raise the rifle. Instead, she stood for a long moment, just looking down the range, her body perfectly still. She seemed to be measuring the distance with her eyes, feeling the air in the room, becoming one with the space between her and the target. Then she began to move. It was a slow, deliberate dance. She shifted her feet, placing them shoulder-width apart. She settled her weight, finding a perfect, stable balance. She was not just standing there. She was building a foundation, a human tripod for the rifle. She brought the rifle up to her shoulder. The movement was fluid, seamless. The stock of the rifle nestled into the pocket of her shoulder as if it had been custom-made for her. Her left hand supported the forend of the rifle, her grip firm but relaxed. Her right hand found the pistol grip, her finger resting lightly alongside the trigger guard, not on the trigger itself. She leaned forward slightly, her cheek pressing against the stock, her eye lining up perfectly with the iron sights. From the side, she looked completely different. The frail old woman was gone. In her place was a statue of pure concentration, every part of her body aligned for a single purpose. The slight stoop in her shoulders had straightened. The softness in her face had been replaced by a hard-edged focus. She was no longer a sweet old lady. She was a marksman. The young men watched, their mouths slightly agape. They had never seen anything like it. They were all about speed and firepower, about sending as many bullets downrange as they could. This was something else entirely. This was an art form. They could feel the tension in the air, a palpable energy that radiated from the woman in lane 4. They were no longer just spectators. They were witnesses to something they didn't understand but knew was important. The woman took a deep breath and then let it out slowly. A long, controlled exhale. In the moment of quiet between breaths, when her body was at its most still, her finger gently squeezed the trigger. The rifle cracked. It wasn't the deafening boom they were used to, but a sharp, clean report that cut through the air like a whip. There was no muzzle flash, no dramatic recoil that threw her off balance. The rifle kicked back into her shoulder, a solid, controlled push, and then settled back into place. She never moved. Her cheek remained welded to the stock, her eyes still peering down the sights. For a second, no one did anything. They just stared, their ears ringing. Then the man at the counter reached for the controls of the target retrieval system. He pressed a button, and the motor whirred to life, slowly pulling the small piece of paper back, toward them. All eyes were on that dark smudge as it grew larger and larger, coming back from the distance. The young men held their breath, their hearts pounding in their chests. They didn't know what they were expecting to see, but they knew it was going to change everything. Asterisk, the motor of the target retrieval system, hummed. A low, monotonous sound that seemed to stretch time itself. Every eye in the shooting range was fixed on the small piece of paper as it made its slow journey back from the distant wall. The young men who had been so full of bravado just minutes earlier now stood as if frozen. Their own expensive firearms forgotten and leaning against the counter. Their world had shrunk to that single piece of paper and the quiet, unassuming woman who had sent it on its way. The air, once thick with their laughter and the smell of their hot gunpowder, was now charged with a silent electric tension. It was the feeling of a moment turning, of a story taking a completely unexpected direction. As the target drew closer, the details began to resolve. The black circles of the concentric rings became clearer. The young man with the AR-15 felt his heart hammering against his ribs. He was a good shot, or at least he thought he was. At 50 yards, he could keep his shots in a decent group, especially with his scope. But 100 yards with iron sights from a standing position with only one shot to prove yourself, that was a different league entirely. He found himself holding his breath, a part of him desperately hoping she had missed, not out of malice. But because her success would shatter his understanding of the world, the target finally reached the end of the track and stopped with a soft clink. There was a collective, almost audible intake of breath from the onlookers. The man behind the counter leaned so far over his desk that his beard nearly brushed the plexiglass shield. The young men craned their necks, their eyes wide. There, in the center of the target, was a single perfect hole. It was not just in the black. It was not just in the inner ring. It was directly in the center of the bullseye, a tiny, jagged tear that marked the exact heart of the target. It was the kind of shot that people talk about, the kind of shot that legends are made of. It wasn't luck. Luck is sloppy. Luck is a shot that grazes the edge of the bullseye. This was precision. This was skill honed over a lifetime. The silence that followed was profound. It was the silence of utter disbelief. The young men stared at the target, then at the woman, then back at the target, as if trying to connect the two with a logic they could understand. But there was no logic for them to grasp. It was like watching a chef burn a piece of toast and then, in the next moment, create a 5-course meal. The two things simply did not fit together in their minds. The old woman, however, did not seem to think anything of it. She lowered the rifle from her shoulder, the movement as smooth and controlled as when she had raised it. She opened the bolt, catching the hot spent brass casing as it ejected. She held it in her palm for a moment, feeling its warmth, before placing it carefully into her pocket. She was not celebrating. She was not looking for praise. She was simply done. For her, this was not a miracle. It was just a single well-placed shot. She turned to face the small crowd that had gathered, her expression calm and unreadable. She took off her earmuffs, and the quiet sounds of the range seemed to rush back in. The man behind the counter was the first to speak, his voice a low, reverent whisper. "Ma'am," he said, shaking his head slowly in awe. That was the shot of a lifetime. The woman offered him a small, modest smile. "It was a good shot," she said simply. "The light is good in here today. And the rifle is feeling cooperative." She spoke as if the rifle were a living partner in this endeavor. It's not just an object. The young man who had mocked her felt a wave of heat wash over his face. He was humiliated, but it was a strange kind of humiliation. It wasn't the burning anger of being insulted. It was a deeper, more profound feeling of being small, of realizing that his own world of flashy gear and loud talk was a shallow, childish thing compared to the quiet depth of her skill. He had judged her based on her appearance, on the softness of her hair, and the frailty of her hands. And he had been wrong in the most spectacular way possible. He wanted to say something. He wanted to apologize, to explain, to say anything that might bridge the vast chasm that had opened up between them. But the words caught in his throat. What could he possibly say? "Sorry, I thought you were a helpless old lady when you're actually one of the best shots I've ever seen." The words sounded ridiculous even in his own head. His friend, with the blue handgun, the one who had made the joke about loading one bullet at a time, was staring at the target with a dazed expression. He was a competitive guy, always looking for an edge, always trying to be the best. Seeing that single, perfect hole in the paper was like watching a marathon runner get lapped by someone who looked like they were out for a casual stroll. It fundamentally challenged his idea of what was possible. The old woman began to pack up her things. She wiped down the rifle one last time with a soft, oiled cloth, her movements loving and precise. She broke the rifle down with an economy of motion that was fascinating to watch. Each piece fitting perfectly into its place in the worn leather case. It was a ritual, a performance of care and respect that was as compelling as the shot itself. As she closed the latches on the case, the young man with the AR-15 finally found his voice. It came out quieter than he intended, stripped of all its earlier arrogance. How did you do that?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. The woman paused, her hand resting on the handle of the case. She looked at him, and for the first time, there was a flicker of something in her eyes. It wasn't pity, and it wasn't pride. It was something more like understanding. She could see the genuine confusion and awe on his face. She didn't answer him directly. Instead, she looked down at her own hands, turning them over as if seeing them for the first time. They were old hands, wrinkled and spotted with age, but they were also strong and steady. "My husband," she said, her voice soft and filled with a quiet warmth. He was in the service. He was a marksman. He used to say that shooting isn't about how strong you are or how fast you can pull the trigger. He said it's about patience. It's about controlling your breath, calming your mind, and becoming part of the rifle. He taught me everything. She looked back up at the young man, her gaze direct and clear. He passed away a few years ago. This was his rifle. I come here sometimes to feel close to him, to remember the lessons he taught me. She gave him another small, sad smile. He was a good teacher. With that, she picked up her leather case and her folded cardigan. She gave a polite nod to the man behind the counter, who simply nodded back, his face still a mask of amazement. Then she turned and began to walk away, her slow, measured steps echoing in the silent room. The young men watched her go, not saying a word. They didn't laugh. They didn't nudge each other. They just stood there, their eyes fixed on the small, retreating figure until the heavy glass door swung shut behind her. The silence in the range lasted for a long moment after she was gone. Finally, the man with the blue handgun let out a long, slow whistle. "Wow," he said, the single word conveying everything he was feeling. The first young man walked over to the target and unclipped it from the carrier. He held it in his hands, the paper feeling light and insignificant. He stared at the single, perfect hole in the center. It was a hole that had not just pierced a piece of paper, but had pierced his own arrogance and preconceptions. He looked at his own rifle, leaning against the wall, and it suddenly seemed different to him. It was just a tool. The real skill, the real power, wasn't in the equipment. It was in the person holding it. And he had just been given a lesson he would never, ever forget. The heavy glass door swung shut, and with its final pneumatic hiss, the old woman was gone. But her presence lingered in the shooting range like the smell of ozone after a lightning strike. The silence she left behind was heavy, filled with the unspoken thoughts of everyone who had witnessed the impossible. For a long moment, no one moved. The young men stood frozen in their lane, the expensive, high-tech firearms in their hands suddenly feeling like cheap, clumsy toys. The man behind the counter remained leaning forward, his gaze fixed on the empty space where she had stood, his mind trying to process what he had just seen. The first young man to break. The spell was the one who had mocked her so openly. He slowly, almost reverently, walked over to the target retrieval system and unclipped the piece of paper. He held it in his hands, the lightness of it belying the weight of what it represented. He stared at the single, perfectly round hole in the center of the bullseye. It was so clean, so precise. It didn't look like the work of a human hand. It looked like a machine had punched it out. He traced the edge of the hole with his finger, the rough, torn paper a stark contrast to the impossible accuracy of its placement. His friend with the blue handgun joined him, peering over his shoulder. "I don't get it," he said, his voice a low murmur of disbelief. "How is that even possible? From a standing position? With no scope?" The third man, who had been quieter throughout the whole exchange, just shook his head. "It's not just the shot," he said, his voice filled with a new kind of understanding. "It was everything. The way she held the rifle, the way she breathed. She wasn't just shooting, she was meditating with a gun." The first man nodded, his eyes still glued to the target. He thought about her words, about her husband teaching her, about coming here to feel close to him. The story she had told, so simple and so brief, had added a layer of profoundness to the shot that made it even more incredible. It wasn't just a display of skill. It was an act of love, a memory made real. He felt a deep sense of shame wash over him. He and his friends had come here to feel powerful, to show off. They had treated the range like their personal playground, a place to boost their egos. She had treated it like a sacred space, a place of memory and respect. He looked at his own rifle, the AR-15 with its fancy red dot sight and its comfortable pistol grip. It was designed to make shooting easy, to compensate for a lack of skill. Her rifle, the simple wooden one, had demanded skill. It had demanded a partnership between the shooter and the gun. He suddenly felt a disconnect from his own weapon, feeling that it was doing all the work for him, that his own contribution was minimal. The thought was unsettling. "Hey," the man behind the counter called out, his voice gentle. "You boys want to see something?" They walked over to the counter, the target still in the first man's hand. The man behind the counter tapped a few keys on his computer, turning the monitor around so they could see. He pulled up a black and white photograph from an old digital archive. The picture showed a group of soldiers from a bygone era, their uniforms crisp and their faces serious. In the middle of the front row stood a man with a kind face and sharp, intelligent eyes. He was holding a rifle that was unmistakably the same one the old woman had been using. "That's her husband," the man behind the counter said softly. "He used to come in here all the time before he got sick. He was a quiet man, just like her. But he could shoot the wings off a fly at 100 yards. Taught a few classes here, too. Always said the same thing she did. It's not the arrow, it's the Indian." The young men stared at the photograph, the pieces of the puzzle finally clicking into place. The rifle wasn't just an old gun. It was a legacy. The skill wasn't just a party trick. It was a trenchum, a torch passed from one generation to the next. They had not just mocked an old lady. They had mocked a lifetime of dedication, a story of love and loss, and the memory of a man who had been a legend in this very building. The first young man felt a lump form in his throat. He looked at the target in his hand, then at the photograph on the screen, and then at his friends. The cocky, arrogant facade he had worn so comfortably just an hour ago had crumbled away, leaving behind something raw and humbled. Can I keep this?" he asked, holding up the target. The man behind the counter smiled. "I think she'd like that," he said. "I think he would have too." The young man carefully folded the target, the single hole in the center like a bullseye on his own ego. He didn't put it in his bag. He folded it small and put it in his wallet, a constant physical reminder of the lesson he had learned. The three of them stood there for a while longer, not talking, just processing. The loud, boisterous energy they had brought into the range was gone, replaced by a quiet, contemplative mood. They eventually gathered their things, their movements slower, more deliberate than before. They packed up their rifles with a newfound respect, no longer seeing them as just toys, but as tools that demanded skill and discipline. As they were about to leave, the first young man walked back to the counter. "Thank you," he said to the man behind the counter, for showing us that we all need a reminder sometimes," he said. The young men walked out of the range and into the bright afternoon sun. The world outside seemed different, sharper, more real. They got into their truck, the ride home silent. Each of them was lost in his own thoughts, thinking about the frail old lady with the steady hands and the gentle eyes. They had come to the range looking for a good time, a chance to show off. They were leaving with something far more valuable, a profound and humbling lesson in judging a book by its cover, and a newfound respect for the quiet, unassuming power of a true master. The story of the old lady at the shooting range was a story they would tell for the rest of their lives. Not as a funny anecdote, but as a pivotal moment, a turning point in their own understanding of the world. Asterisk, the ride home in the truck was unlike any other they had shared. The usual banter, the loud music, the competitive jabs were all gone. The silence in the cab was not awkward. It was heavy, filled with the weight of what they had just witnessed. The young man who had been so quick to mock drove with both hands on the wheel. His eyes fixed on the road ahead, but his mind was 100 yards down an indoor shooting range. He could still see her, the slight figure, the calm demeanor, the impossible shot. He could still hear her soft voice explaining about her husband, about patience, about becoming one with the rifle. Every few miles, one of them would let out a slow, shaky breath, as if they had been holding it in since she had fired that single perfect round. The friend with the blue handgun stared out the window, watching the world go by, but he wasn't really seeing it. He was seeing the target, the single hole in the bullseye. A physical manifestation of a skill so far beyond his own that it felt like it belonged to a different species. He thought about all the times he had bragged about his shooting, all the money he had spent on custom parts and accessories, all the confidence he had projected. It all seemed so hollow now, so childish. He had been playing a game, and she'd been living a discipline. When they finally got back to the house, they didn't immediately head to the fridge or turn on the television, as they usually did. They just stood in the middle of the living room for a moment, the silence following them inside like a loyal dog. The first young man finally broke the quiet. He walked over to his gun safe, a large, heavy thing that he had always been proud of. He opened the combination lock with practice movements and pulled out his AR-15. He held it in his hands. But it felt different. It felt heavier, not in weight, but in responsibility. He looked at the red dot sight, the comfortable grip, the high-capacity magazine. It was a tool designed for speed and efficiency, for overwhelming a target with a hail of bullets. He thought about her rifle, the simple wooden one with the iron sights. It was a tool for precision, for a single, decisive act. He realized with a jolt of clarity that he had never truly learned to shoot. He had only learned to aim his expensive equipment. His friends watched him, understanding completely. They had all come to the same conclusion. They had been faking it, and they had been exposed, not by ridicule, but by a quiet, unshakable grace. The young man placed his rifle back in the safe, his movements slow and deliberate. He didn't lock it right away. He just stood there, looking at the collection of firearms he had accumulated over the years. And for the first time, he saw them not as trophies, but as questions he didn't know how to answer. The next few weeks were a period of quiet transformation. The group of friends still went to the range, but they were different. They were quieter, more focused. They left their fancy rifles at home and started showing up with old .22 caliber rifles they found in the back of their closets. They took off the scopes. They practiced with iron sights, just like she had. They missed. A lot. Their groups were sloppy, their shots were inconsistent, and their frustration grew. But they didn't quit. They pushed through the humiliation of their own incompetence, driven by the memory of that single, perfect hole in the paper. They started talking to the older shooters at the range. The quiet men, who had been there for years, the ones they used to ignore. They asked for advice. They listened. They learned about breathing, about trigger control, about stance. They learned that shooting was not about being loud and aggressive. It was about being calm and centered. It was a mental game as much as a physical one. They were starting from scratch, stripping away years of bad habits and ego, and building a new foundation on the principles she had so effortlessly demonstrated one rainy afternoon. About a month after their encounter, the young man with the AR-15 was at the range by chance. It was a weekday, and the place was mostly empty. He was practicing with a simple bolt-action .22, his shots slowly getting tighter, his focus growing sharper. He was in his own world, concentrating on the front sight post, trying to make it perfectly still in the rear aperture. The door to the lobby opened, and he glanced up out of habit. His heart skipped a beat. It was her. She was wearing the same cardigan, her hair in the same neat bun. She carried the same worn leather case. She moved with the same slow, deliberate grace. She didn't seem to notice him at first. She just went to the counter, paid for her lane, and walked toward the empty stalls. The young man felt a surge of nervousness, a feeling he hadn't experienced in a long time. He wanted to say something, to apologize properly, to thank her. But he didn't know how. She chose the lane right next to his. As she set up her things, he finally worked up the courage. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, his voice quiet and respectful. She turned, her pale blue eyes landing on him. A flicker of recognition crossed her face, followed by a gentle, knowing smile. "Hello," she said. "Working on your iron sights, I see." He nodded, feeling a blush creep up his neck. "Yes, ma'am. It's harder than it looks," she chuckled, a soft, warm sound. "Anything worth doing is." She looked at his target, which had a decent, but not perfect group of shots in the black. "You're getting better," she said. "Your patience is improving." "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. I wanted to apologize for how we acted that day. We were idiots." She waved her hand dismissively. "You were young," in loud. "It's a common combination." She looked at him, her eyes full of a deep, unwavering kindness. "But I see a change in you. That's what matters. Don't be so hard on yourselves. Everyone starts somewhere." With that, she turned back to her own lane and began to prepare her rifle. The young man watched her, his heart filled with a sense of gratitude he had never felt before. He didn't say anything else. He just turned back to his own lane, a new sense of determination washing over him. He didn't try to show off. He didn't try to compete. He just focused on his own shooting, on his own breath, on his own journey. They shot in silence for the next hour, to people in their own worlds, sharing a quiet space and a mutual, unspoken respect. When she was finished, she packed up her things, just as she had before. As she was about to leave, she stopped and turned to him. "My husband used to say," she said, her voice soft, "that the best target isn't the one on the paper. It's the one you were yesterday. Always try to be better than you were yesterday." She gave him a small nod, turned, and walked away. Disappearing through the heavy glass door, the young man stood there for a long time, her words echoing in his mind. He knew he would never see her again, but he also knew that he would never forget her. She had not just taught them a lesson about shooting. She had taught them a lesson about life. She had taught them about humility, about respect, about the quiet power of dedication, and the beauty of a life lived with purpose. The story of the old lady at the shooting range became a legend among their circle of friends, and eventually, throughout the entire community, it was told and retold. A cautionary tale against arrogance and a testament to the idea that true strength is often found in the most unassuming of places. The young men who had mocked her that day were changed forever. They became better shooters, but more importantly, they became better men. They learned to listen more than they talked, to respect their elders, and to approach every challenge with a sense of humility and a desire to learn. And every time they stepped up to the firing line, they would take a deep breath, calm their minds, and remember the frail old lady who picked up a rifle and with a single shot changed their lives forever.